January 1995, a wooden crate was lowered onto the snow in Yellowstone National Park. Inside it was a single gray wolf. The wolf had been captured in Canada, sedated, transported across the border, and brought to one of the most famous pieces of land in America. When the crate door was opened, the wolf stepped out slowly, looked around at the valley it had never seen, and disappeared into the trees. 13 more wolves followed over the next few weeks. 14 wolves dropped into 2.2 million acres of wilderness. Scientists, ranchers, politicians, and protesters all watched for completely different reasons. Some believed this was one of the greatest conservation experiments in history. Others believed it was ecological madness that would devastate livestock across 3 states. A few people stood outside the park gates holding signs that said the wolves should be shot on sight. What nobody, not the scientists, not the ranchers, not the protesters, predicted was what actually happened. Within a decade, those 14 wolves had changed the course of rivers. Not metaphorically, the actual, physical rivers of Yellowstone changed direction. Water that had been flowing one way for decades began carving new channels. Riverbanks that had been eroding for 70 years began to rebuild. The geography of the land itself began to shift, all because of wolves. This is the true, fully documented story of the most extraordinary ecological chain reaction in modern scientific history. And it begins not in 1995, but 70 years earlier, with a decision that nearly destroyed one of the most remarkable places on Earth. To understand what 14 wolves did to Yellowstone, you first need to understand what 70 years without them had already done. Yellowstone National Park was established in 1872, the first national park in the United States, and one of the first in the world. It covers over 2 million acres across Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. It contains geysers, hot springs, canyons, waterfalls, forests, and grasslands. It has been called one of the last remaining examples of large-scale wilderness in North America. And for most of its existence, the gray wolf was at the center of everything that made it work. Wolves had roamed Yellowstone for thousands of years. They were the park's apex predator, the top of the food chain, the animal that everything else in the ecosystem organized itself around. Not because they were the most numerous animal in the park. Far from it. But because of what they did to every other animal, simply by being present. They kept the elk moving. That singular fact that wolves kept elk moving turns out to be one of the most consequential ecological relationships in the history of the natural world. And the US government spent the early 1900s systematically destroying it without understanding what it was. In the first decades of the 20th century, the prevailing attitude toward wolves in America was not complicated. Wolves were dangerous. Wolves killed livestock. Wolves were competition for hunters who wanted elk and deer for themselves. And wolves were predators, which, in the thinking of the time, automatically made them the enemy of everything good and natural and productive about the American landscape. So the government killed them. Rangers shot wolves on sight, inside Yellowstone itself. Trappers were paid bounties. Poison was laid across the landscape. The campaign was efficient and thorough. In a little over a decade, from 1914 to 1926, at least 136 wolves were killed inside the park. By 1926, when 2 pups near Soda Butte Creek were shot by park rangers, the gray wolf was functionally extinct in Yellowstone. The last wolf in the park was dead. The apex predator of a 2-million-acre ecosystem had been entirely removed. And at first, nothing seemed wrong. The elk were still there. The rivers were still there. The forests were still there. The geysers were still erupting on schedule. Yellowstone looked, from the outside, completely fine. But something had already started to go wrong, and it would take decades for anyone to fully understand what it was. Without wolves, the elk in Yellowstone did what any animal does when its primary predator disappears. They stopped being afraid. Before the wolves were killed, elk had to keep moving. They could not spend too long in any one place, because wolves could find them. They could not linger in the open valleys, because wolves hunted in packs and could run them down. They could not graze for hours on the lush vegetation along riverbanks, because riverbanks were exactly the kind of terrain where a wolf pack could cut off their escape routes. Fear kept them moving. And because fear kept them moving, no single area of the park ever got overgrazed. With the wolves gone, that fear vanished. elk herds settled. They found the most productive grazing land in the park. The green, lush, vegetation-rich areas along the rivers and valley floors. And they stayed. They ate. And they kept eating, day after day, season after season, year after year, for 7 decades. The elk population, unchecked by predation, exploded. By the early 1990s, the northern Yellowstone elk herd had swelled to nearly 20,000 animals. 20,000 elk grazing the same river valleys. Without stopping, a team of scientists who visited Yellowstone in 1929 and again in 1933 described what they found in language that was unusually direct for scientific reports. The range was in deplorable conditions when we first saw it, they wrote, and its deterioration has been progressing steadily since then. The willows were gone, the aspens were gone, the cottonwoods were gone. Every young tree and shrub that grew along the riverbanks was being eaten down to a stub before it could reach any height. Without the roots of those trees holding the soil in place, the riverbanks began to collapse. Without the shade of those trees cooling the water, river temperatures rose. The rivers became shallow, wide, and silted with eroded soil. And then the beavers left. Beavers need willows. Willows are the primary material they use to build their dams and their lodges, and the primary food source they rely on through winter. When the willows disappeared from Yellowstone's rivers, there was nothing left for beavers. By 1995, when the first wolves were finally brought back, there was only one beaver colony left in the entire 2-million-acre park. One. When the beavers left, their dams went with them. When the dams went, the rivers lost the structures that regulated their flow, maintained their depth, and kept their water cold and clear. Fish populations crashed. Amphibians declined. Otters disappeared. Cold water species that depended on shaded, clean rivers simply could not survive in what those rivers had become. All because the elk had stopped being afraid. All because 70 years earlier, a ranger had shot the last wolves in the park. The argument for bringing wolves back had been building for decades, but it was politically explosive every step of the way. Ranchers near Yellowstone were furious. Wolves do not respect park boundaries, and they were right about that. If wolves were reintroduced, livestock on the lands surrounding the park would be at risk. Organizations representing ranching communities spent years lobbying against the reintroduction plan. Some threatened legal action. Some threatened the wolves directly. Wildlife biologists argued back with data. Yellowstone was degrading. The elk overpopulation was destroying the ecosystem from the inside. The Endangered Species Act, passed in 1973, required the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to restore gray wolves to their natural habitat. The science was clear. The law was clear. The only question was whether the political will existed to actually do it. In January 1995, after years of environmental reviews, legal battles, and public debate, 14 wolves were transported from Alberta, Canada, in wooden crates and released into the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone National Park. The protesters were outside. The biologists were watching with radio telemetry equipment. The ranchers were waiting for the first livestock kill, and the wolves walked into the trees. What happened over the following years was something scientists had a word for but had never seen at this scale. A trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is what happens when the removal or addition of a top predator creates a chain reaction through every level of an ecosystem. It is the ecological version of a domino effect. Except the dominoes do not just fall, they rebuild. Each one that is restored causes something else to recover, which causes something else to come back, which triggers something else to change, in a chain that ripples outward across the entire landscape. The wolves began hunting elk immediately, and the elk did something that the scientists had predicted but still found remarkable to actually watch happen. They changed where they went, not just how many of them there were, though that changed dramatically too. Over the following decade, elk numbers in the northern range fell from nearly 20,000 to between 4,000 and 6,000 as wolf predation took effect. But the more immediately significant change was behavioral. The elk stopped going to the valleys. They stopped gathering on the riverbanks. They stopped lingering in the open terrain where a wolf pack could surround them. A new concept entered the ecological literature. Scientists called it the landscape of fear. The elk were still there, but they were afraid again, and that fear expressed as movement. as caution, as a reluctance to stay too long in any one place, changed everything. Within just a few years, the willows started growing back. At first it was subtle, a few inches of new growth that hadn't been grazed off, then more. Then stands of willow along creek banks reaching heights they hadn't seen in decades. Then aspen groves regenerating. Then cottonwood, then berry-producing shrubs. Then the songbirds came back. The common yellowthroat, the warbling vireo, the song sparrow species that had been absent from Yellowstone for years, returned to nest in the recovering vegetation. And then the beavers came back. In 1995, there had been one beaver colony in the entire park. By 2009, there were 12. By recent counts, there are at least 9 established colonies, and growing. The beavers build dams. The dams raise the water table along the rivers. The raised water table fed the willows, which grew taller, which gave the beavers more material to build with, which let them build more dams, which raised the water table further. The rivers began to cool. Cold water returned to stream systems that had been warm and silted for decades. Fish came back, amphibians came back, otters returned, and then something happened that stopped scientists in their tracks. The rivers changed course. This is the part of the story that made headlines around the world, and that a film made in 2014 has now been watched over 45 million times. As the willows and aspens and cottonwoods grew back along the riverbanks, their roots did something that bare, eroded riverbank could never do. They held the soil in place. The erosion slowed. Then it stopped. With stable banks on both sides, rivers that had been wide, shallow, and wandering began to deepen and narrow. Channels that had been spreading out across the valley floor began to concentrate. The rivers, freed from the constant erosion that had been reshaping them for 7 decades, began to stabilize, and in stabilizing, they carved new paths. Channels deepened. Pools formed where before there had been only shallow mud. Water that had been spreading wide and warm concentrated into faster, cooler, cleaner currents. The physical geography of Yellowstone, the actual contours of the land, the direction of water flow, the shape of valley floors, began to shift, because wolves had made elk afraid to stand on riverbanks. That chain, wolves, 2 elk behavior, 2 willow regrowth, 2 behavior dams, 2 soil stabilization, 2 river channels is now one of the most famous examples of ecological thinking in the world. It is a trophic cascade, and researchers who have compared Yellowstone's cascade to similar events studied in ecosystems across the planet found that Yellowstone's ranked among the strongest and most well-documented ever recorded. Professor Robert Beshta of Oregon State University, who spent years studying Yellowstone's waterways, described what decades of unchecked elk grazing had done as essentially removing the woody plant communities that once lined many streams. After the wolves returned, he watched those communities come back. He watched the rivers change, and he noted, with the careful restraint of a scientist who had spent his career dealing in data, the changes were remarkable. Doug Smith, the wildlife biologist who led the Yellowstone Wolf Project and who has studied these wolves for 30 years, put it differently. It is like kicking a pebble down a mountain slope, he said, where conditions were just right that a falling pebble could trigger an avalanche of change. Here's the number that perhaps captures the scale of what 14 wolves did better than any other single fact. The total costs of the wolf reintroduction program, from the initial captures in Canada through 3 decades of monitoring, management, and research, is approximately $30 million. Wolf ecotourism in the Yellowstone region now generates $35 million annually. The wolves paid for themselves and then kept paying. Not because anyone planned for it, but because when you restore a broken ecosystem, the ecosystem does what ecosystems do. It recovers. And a recovering ecosystem is, among other things, extraordinarily beautiful. Hundreds of thousands of visitors come to Yellowstone specifically hoping to see wolves. They bring money to hotels, restaurants, and guide services across Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. The ranching communities that fought hardest against the reintroduction have found themselves living next. Dordu, one of the most economically productive wildlife watching destinations on Earth. Grizzly bear numbers have increased because wolves kill elk and leave carcasses that bears feed on. Raven populations have grown for the same. Reason: eagles, coyotes, foxes, badgers, hawks, weasels, every scavenger and secondary predator in the ecosystem benefits from a regular supply of wolf-killed prey and from the broader health of a landscape that is no longer being stripped bare by unchecked herbivores. A 2025 study that measured the strength of Yellowstone's Trophic Cascade compared two similar studies conducted in 82% of equivalent ecosystems worldwide found that Yellowstone ranked among the most powerful on record. Willow crown volume, a measure of how healthy and tall the willow stands along rivers have become, grew by a factor of 16 between 2001 and 2020. 16 times, in a place that had been essentially a willow desert 2 decades earlier. But the story is not entirely one of triumph. Scientists who have studied the Yellowstone case most carefully are careful to say that the popular version of the story, wolves arrive, elk run scared, willows grow back, rivers change, is a simplification. The Trophic Cascade is real. The vegetation recovery is real. The river changes are real. But the mechanisms are more complicated than the simple narrative suggests. Elk numbers fell for multiple reasons, including hunting pressure outside the park boundaries and other predators like bears and cougars. The landscape of fear theory, the idea that elk changed their behavior purely because they were scared of wolves, has been debated and refined over 3 decades of research. The science, as science always does, is more nuanced than the headline. What is not nuanced? What is confirmed, documented, and agreed upon across the scientific community is that the return of wolves to Yellowstone produced one of the most dramatic ecological recoveries ever recorded anywhere in the world, and that the most powerful driver of that recovery was not a massive intervention or an expensive technology or a government program. It was 14 animals walking out of wooden crates, into the snow, doing exactly what they had always done. So, what does this mean? Why does it matter beyond the borders of one park in the American West? It means something very specific about how ecosystems work. And it is the opposite of what the people who killed the last Yellowstone wolves in 1926 believed. They believed that nature was a collection of separate pieces that could be managed individually. Kill the wolves, protect the livestock, preserve the elk for hunters, maintain the scenery. Each decision isolated, each consequence contained. What Yellowstone proved at a scale that has convinced scientists around the world and changed the way conservation biology approaches restoration projects is that ecosystems are not collections of separate pieces. They are systems. They are networks of relationships so interwoven that removing one connection does not just eliminate that connection. It starts a cascade that eventually reaches everything. The US government removed wolves in the 1920s to protect livestock and please hunters. What they actually did was remove the mechanism that kept elk moving, which stripped the riverbanks bare, which ended the beavers, which unraveled the fish, the birds, the amphibians, the otters, and the physical course of the rivers themselves. They pulled one thread. The whole thing came apart. Mao Zedong killed 1 billion sparrows to save grain for his people. What he actually did was remove the predator that kept locusts in check, triggering a famine that killed tens of millions. Pablo Escobar imported 4 hippos to Colombia for entertainment. What he actually created was a biological invasion that is still reshaping South American river ecosystems today. The pattern is the same every time. A powerful entity decides it understands nature well enough to remove one piece of it. And nature, which does not recognize the authority of governments, or dictators, or drug lords, responds by demonstrating, slowly, at a scale that eventually becomes impossible to ignore, that every piece is connected to every other piece. The only difference in the Yellowstone story is that this time, humanity made the opposite decision. Instead of removing a piece of nature, they put one back, and the rivers changed course. Today, Yellowstone's wolf population numbers around 100 animals. The willows are taller than they have been in a century. The beaver colonies are multiplying. The rivers are running cleaner and deeper than they did in 1994. Songbirds that had not been heard in the park for decades are nesting again in the regenerated vegetation. The experiment that began with 14 wolves in wooden crates on a January morning in 1995 is still running. Scientists are still watching, still measuring, still debating the precise mechanisms of what happened and what continues to happen. The story is not finished, but the rivers are different. That part is not debated by anyone. And the only thing that changed, the only variable that was introduced into a system that had been broken for 70 years, was wolves. If this story changed the way you think about nature, about how ecosystems work, about what happens when you remove a single species, about what it means to put one back, then share this video. Because this is not just a story about wolves or elk or rivers in Wyoming. It is a story about connection, about the invisible threads that hold the natural world together, and about what happens when human beings are humble enough to admit they made a mistake and try to fix it. What do you think should happen in other broken ecosystems around the world? Should more apex predators be reintroduced? Should we be doing this in more places? Tell us in the comments. And subscribe, because every week we bring you a true story more extraordinary than anything you were taught in school.